From a Soviet spy to an American oil king, Armand Hammer built an empire on lies and money laundering. But the most terrifying legacy he left behind was a depraved gene. His grandson killed a man over a gambling debt. His great-grandson, Hollywood star Armie Hammer, was accused of sexual cannibalism. On the red carpet, they looked like American royalty. Tall, handsome, and impossibly rich, they owned Occidental Petroleum, art galleries, and the era presidents. But behind the closed doors of their Cayman Island compound, the Hammers were hiding a century of crimes. Beyond the tabloid frenzy of a disgraced movie star lies a century-long forensic timeline, a bloodline systematically infected by absolute power. It involves espionage for the KGB, a sex throne in a charity headquarters, forced plastic surgery, and a father who washed his hands of a murder with cash. This is the stark truth about House of Hammer, the birth of the depraved gene. Forget the sterile boardrooms of corporate America. The Hammer dynasty was conceived in the suffocating heat of a 1919 Bronx medical clinic, born from a botched surgery and a father's cold decision to bury the truth. The foundation of the family's century-long dominance was laid upon a singular, gruesome event: the death of a woman on a surgical table and the subsequent conspiracy to bury the truth. Before there were private jets, oil fields, or galleries filled with stolen masterpieces, there was only a botched abortion and a father's decision to sacrifice his own freedom to unleash his son upon the world. On July 5, 1919, the air inside the Bronx home of Dr. Julius Hammer was heavy with the oppressive humidity of a New York summer. Julius was a man of contradictions, a Russian Jewish immigrant who had clawed his way to respectability as a gynecologist, yet secretly operated as a founding member of the Communist Party USA. He lived a double life, balancing the sterile precision of medicine with the radical fervor of Bolshevik ideology. But on that Saturday morning, ideology was secondary to a desperate medical transaction. The patient was Marie Oganesov, the 33-year-old wife of a former Tsarist diplomat. She was frail, terrified, and dangerously pregnant. With a history of severe heart disease and recovering from the Spanish flu, another pregnancy was a death sentence. She had been rejected by legitimate hospitals, leaving her with only one option: the illegal clinic of the radical doctor. The events that transpired inside that procedure room remain the primal wound of the Hammer family history. 6 days after the surgery, Marie Oganesov was dead. The official cause was peritonitis and septicemia, the result of a perforated uterus. The brutality of the procedure suggested not just a mistake, but incompetence. The authorities moved swiftly. Dr. Julius Hammer was arrested, charged with first-degree manslaughter, and branded a butcher in the press. He was sentenced to 3.5 to 12 years of hard labor in the notorious Sing Sing prison. However, a deeper investigation into the timeline and family archives suggests that Julius Hammer was not the killer. He was the cleaner. On the day of the operation, Julius was recorded as attending a Communist Party meeting miles away from the clinic. The only other person in the house with access to the surgical instruments was his son, Armand Hammer. At 21 years old, Armand was a medical student at Columbia University, arrogant, ambitious, but entirely unqualified to perform surgery. The prevailing theory, supported by decades of historical analysis, posits that Armand attempted the abortion to prove his prowess, or perhaps to cover for his father, but his inexperienced hand slipped, perforating the uterine wall. When the patient went into septic shock, he called his father in a panic. Julius, staring at the ruin of a woman's life and the potential destruction of his son's future, made a cold, calculated decision. He was already an old man, a target of the government for his politics. Armand was the golden child, the vessel for the family's ascent. Julius took the blame. He walked into a prison cell so that Armand could walk into a boardroom. This was the first lesson Armand Hammer learned about power. Guilt is transferable, and people are disposable assets to be burned for survival. With his father erasing the consequences of the crime from behind bars, Armand did not retreat into shame. He accelerated. He took control of the family business, allied drug and chemical, and immediately displayed the predatory instincts that would define his career. It was the height of prohibition. Alcohol was illegal, but the loopholes were wide. Armand realized that the law allowed for the sale of medicinal tinctures containing high percentages of alcohol. He flooded the market with ginger extract, a product that was ostensibly a stomach remedy, but was consumed by the crate as a legal intoxicant. While the rest of the country dealt with bootleggers and gangsters, Armand Hammer was selling liquor in broad daylight, protected by a lab coat and a falsified label. He made his first $1 million not by innovation, but by exploiting the gray zones of American law, turning a public health crisis into a private fortune. But the ambition of the young Armand Hammer could not be contained by the domestic market. In 1921, utilizing the clandestine network his father had built, Armand set his sights on the newly formed Soviet Union. The official narrative he spun for the U.S. State Department was one of humanitarian aid. He claimed he was traveling to the Bolshevik state to set up a field hospital to fight the typhus epidemic ravaging the population. This was a lie. The field hospital was a prop, a piece of theater designed to grant him passage across sealed borders. Armand was not going to Russia to save lives. He was going to monetize death. Arriving in Moscow in the dead of winter, Armand found a country that had been reduced to a frozen, starving graveyard by civil war and economic collapse. Yet, because of his father's martyrdom, the man rotting in Sing Sing for the cause, Armand was received not as a foreign capitalist, but as a hero of the revolution. He was granted an audience that no other Western businessman could dream of, a private meeting with Vladimir Lenin. The encounter between the 23-year-old American hustler and the dying architect of the Soviet state is the singularity point of the Hammer fortune. Lenin, ravaged by strokes and desperate to jumpstart his failing economy, saw in Armand a useful idiot, or perhaps a kindred spirit of ruthlessness. He needed a bridge to American capital. He offered Armand a concession that was staggering in its scope, a monopoly on asbestos mining, and more importantly, pencil manufacturing. It seemed trivial, a concession for school supplies, but in a nation launching a massive literacy campaign with zero manufacturing base, it was a license to print currency. The Hammer Pencil Factory became the first American manufacturing plant in the USSR, a beachhead of capitalism sanctioned by the communist elite. Under the cover of this legitimate business, Armand established the Brown House, a luxurious mansion in Moscow that became the center of social life for the expatriate community and the Soviet elite. While the Russian peasantry starved in the streets, freezing to death in breadlines, Armand lived like a czar. He filled the Brown House with servants, fine wine, and a rotating cast of mistresses. But the pencil factory was merely the front operation. The true engine of wealth extraction was the systematic looting of the Romanov dynasty. Following the execution of Tsar Nicholas II and his family, the Bolsheviks found themselves in possession of centuries of imperial accumulation, warehouses stacked to the ceiling with religious icons, diamond-encrusted crowns, tapestries, and the legendary Fabergé eggs. The Bolsheviks had diamonds, but they had no tractors, no wheat, and no hard currency. They viewed the art not as heritage, but as mineral deposits to be liquidated. Armand Hammer became the fence for the Soviet state. He utilized his export license to move these treasures out of Russia by the ton. He bought priceless artifacts by weight, negotiating deals where he would trade shiploads of grain for crates of imperial diadems. The logistics of this theft were industrial in scale. Armand set up a laundering pipeline, shipping the treasures to his brother Victor in New York and London. To the American customs agents, these were merely household effects or generic art imports. To the world, they were the lost soul of Russia being sold for scrap. But Armand knew that the value of art lies in its story. When he returned to the United States in the early 1930s, he didn't just sell the items, he sold the myth. He organized a traveling circus of commerce, setting up Romanov treasure exhibitions in department stores across Middle America. He stood in Lord & Taylor in St. Louis and Marshall Field's in Chicago, spinning tall tales to wealthy American heiresses about how a specific necklace had been snatched from the neck of a weeping Grand Duchess. He commodified the tragedy of the Romanovs, turning their execution into a sales pitch. Close scrutiny of these sales reveals the second great crime of the Hammer art enterprise, the forgeries. As the supply of genuine Romanov artifacts began to dwindle, Armand did not stop selling. Instead, he began to manufacture inventory. He employed a team of craftsmen to create counterfeit Fabergé stamps and apply them to generic Russian trinkets. He took ordinary icons and embellished them with fake jewels to inflate their provenance. He flooded the American art market with fakes, a practice that established the family's relationship with the art world, not as patrons, but as fraudsters. The Hammer definition of authenticity was whatever Armand said it was. This psychological pattern, the ability to look a customer in the eye and sell them a lie with absolute conviction, would echo down the generations, manifesting decades later in his grandson Michael's involvement in the Knoedler Gallery scandal, where $80 million of fake abstract expressionist paintings were sold to unsuspecting collectors. The art of the deal for the Hammers was always the art of the con, but the money laundering was not a one-way street. Declassified Soviet intelligence files from the Comintern era confirmed that Armand Hammer was not merely a businessman profiting from the Soviet regime. He was an active asset of Soviet military intelligence. The pencil factory and the art exports served as the perfect cover for moving funds into the United States to support underground communist activities and espionage rings. Armand acted as the courier, the bagman for the Kremlin, using his American citizenship and his burgeoning wealth as a shield against FBI scrutiny. He walked a tightrope between treason and capitalism, protected by the sheer volume of money he generated for both sides. When Armand finally left the Soviet Union in 1930, fleeing the encroaching paranoia of Stalin's Great Purge, he left behind a trail of corruption that spanned 2 continents. He had arrived as a medical student with a manslaughter charge hanging over his family. He left as a multimillionaire with a Rolodex of dictators and a cargo hold full of stolen gold. He had learned that laws were merely suggestions for the poor, and that morality was an obstacle to efficiency. He had learned that a father could be sacrificed, a woman could be butchered, and a nation could be looted. And as long as the profit margin was sufficient, the world would call you a genius. Upon his return to New York, he divorced his Russian wife Olga, a woman who had served her purpose as his cultural translator and political anchor, and erased her from the narrative. He was done with the past. He looked west, toward the untapped potential of Los Angeles and a small bankrupt oil company called Occidental Petroleum. The doctor was dead. The spy was retired. The tycoon was born. But the ghost of the Bronx Clinic never truly left him. The DNA of the Hammer dynasty was now set in stone. It was a predatory organism that fed on the weak, hid behind the powerful, and recognized no authority but its own appetite. The gene had been activated and it was hungry. The horrifying secret hidden within Armand Hammer's golden prison. By the mid-1950s, the transformation of Armand Hammer was outwardly complete. The young man who had peddled pencils to Bolsheviks in a frozen Moscow had molted, emerging in the California sun as the epitome of the benevolent American tycoon. He had acquired a failing, obscure drilling firm called Occidental Petroleum, known by its ticker symbol, Oxy, and through sheer force of will and a total disregard for geopolitical ethics, transformed it into a global energy leviathan. However, a forensic audit of Armand's life during the Cold War era reveals that his public persona was merely a high-gloss lacquer applied over a rotting structure. Armand Hammer operated far beyond the bounds of a traditional businessman. He functioned as a state-level actor operating without a flag, a man who imported the brutal, surveillance-heavy tactics of the KGB into the domestic sphere of Los Angeles. He did not just build an oil company, he built a private intelligence agency where he was the director, the interrogator, and the warden. The expansion of Occidental Petroleum into Libya serves as the perfect case study of Armand's modus operandi: bribery on an industrial scale. While major oil conglomerates like Exxon and Shell played by the established rules of international diplomacy, Armand operated in the shadows. To secure drilling rights in the lucrative Libyan desert, he did not rely on geological data. He relied on graft. Intelligence reports and later investigations revealed that Armand authorized massive illicit payments to the officials of King Idris's regime, effectively purchasing the sovereignty of a foreign nation's natural resources. When Colonel Muammar Gaddafi later seized power in a coup, Armand, ever the chameleon, became the first Western oil executive to capitulate to the dictator's demands for a higher revenue share. He didn't care about the precedent it set or the geopolitical instability it caused. He cared about the flow of crude. This ruthless pragmatism established the Hammer family fortune as blood money, wealth extracted from the most volatile and corrupt regions on earth, laundered through the respectability of American capitalism. But Armand's belief that he was above the law faced its most theatrical test during the Watergate scandal. In the early 1970s, as the Nixon presidency crumbled under the weight of its own corruption, investigators discovered a trail of dark money leading back to the Occidental boardroom. Armand was charged with making illegal campaign contributions, $54,000 in cash, delivered in a sinister, clandestine fashion that mirrored his old Soviet bagman days. Armand then initiated a calculated deception. Facing the prospect of a federal cell, the man who crisscrossed the globe on private jets suddenly transformed into a fragile invalid. On the day of his sentencing in a federal courtroom, Armand arrived in a wheelchair. He was hooked up to heart monitors and IV drips, flanked by a team of doctors who testified that any incarceration would be a death sentence for his fragile heart. It was a performance worthy of an Academy Award. The judge, swayed by the spectacle of a dying philanthropist, showed mercy. Armand received a fine and probation. Moments after the verdict was secured and he was safely out of the court's jurisdiction, the miracle occurred. Armand stood up from the wheelchair, disconnected the monitors, and went back to work. He would live for another 18 years, vigorous and unrepentant. The courtroom stunt proved a terrifying truth about the Hammer patriarch. He viewed the American justice system not as a moral authority, but as an audience to be deceived. If his public manipulations were calculating, his private life was a descent into psychological horror. The most disturbing evidence of Armand's depraved gene, the impulse to dominate and rewrite human identity, is found in his relationship with Martha Kaufman. Martha was not merely a mistress, she was a subject in a grotesque experiment of human engineering. Armand met Martha when she was working in the travel department of Occidental. She was blonde, vibrant, and distinct. Armand, however, did not want a distinct woman. He wanted a possession that fit a specific aesthetic template. At the time, Armand was married to his third wife, Frances, whom he had forced to change her name from her birth name to Frances because he preferred it. He called her H. When he began his affair with Martha, he initiated a process that psychologists call identity overwriting. First, he stripped Martha of her name. He demanded she legally change it to Hillary. The forensic significance of this is chilling. He was renaming his mistress to sound like his wife, whom he also called by a similar initial. He was creating a duplicate. But the erasure didn't stop at the name. Armand became obsessed with Martha's physical appearance, specifically her inability to perfectly mirror his fantasy. He began to micromanage her wardrobe, discarding her clothes and replacing them with outfits that were identical in style and cut to those worn by his wife. He forced her to wear wigs that mimicked his wife's hairstyle. Then came the surgery. In a detail that reads like the script of a body horror film, Armand pressured Martha, now Hillary, to undergo cosmetic surgeries she did not need or want. He paid for procedures to alter her face, to mold her features into a specific compliant mask. He was not attracted to her. He was attracted to his power over her biology. He reduced a living, breathing woman to a customizable object, a doll that could be cut, stitched, and renamed to suit the whims of its owner. This behavior establishes the terrifying lineage of the Hammermen. Women are not partners, they are raw material. The echo of this behavior is deafening when one looks at the allegations against his great-grandson, Armie Hammer. 4 generations later, allegations of branding women, marking them, and consuming them. The methodology changed, but the pathology remained identical. Total invasive ownership of the female form. This control extended to the very air his family breathed. The Hammer residence and the Occidental offices were not homes or workplaces. They were cells in a panopticon. Paralyzed by a spy's paranoia, likely a hangover from his days moving money for the KGB, Armand turned his world into a surveillance state. He installed a sophisticated network of listening devices throughout his properties. There were bugs in the chandeliers, bugs in the boardroom tables, and bugs in the bedrooms. Armand wore cufflinks that contained microscopic microphones. He would record conversations with presidents, business rivals, and even his own son and grandchildren. He amassed a vast library of audio tapes, a stash of compromat that he used to ensure loyalty. His son Julian grew up knowing that his father was always listening. There was no privacy, no sanctuary. If a family member stepped out of line, Armand would play back a tape of a private indiscretion, reminding them that he held their reputation in his hand. He weaponized information against his own blood. The environment inside the Hammer dynasty during this golden age was toxic to the core. To the outside world, they were American royalty, attending galas and collecting Renoir. Inside the gates, they were prisoners of a narcissist who viewed them as extensions of his own ego. He controlled their finances, their careers, their names, and their faces. He created a culture where love was transactional and obedience was enforced through blackmail. As the 1950s bled into the 60s and 70s, the pressure of this containment began to fracture the mind of his only son, Julian. Raised in a house where the father was a god king who could bribe dictators and rewrite laws, Julian did not inherit his father's discipline. He inherited the madness without the filter. He was a man-child with unlimited funds and a deep, festering rage against the father who watched his every move. Armand had spent decades building a fortress of money to keep the world out, but he hadn't realized that he had locked a monster inside with him. The depraved gene was about to skip the boardroom and head straight for the gun cabinet. The era of the spy was ending. The era of the killer was about to begin. When money washed away the blood. If Armand Hammer was the architect of the dynasty, a man of cold calculation and strategic foresight, his only son, Julian Hammer, was the structural failure in the blueprint. Born in 1929, Julian was intended to be the heir apparent, the vessel that would carry the Hammer legacy into the next century. Instead, he became the physical manifestation of the family's darkest impulses, stripped of the charm and discipline that made his father dangerous. Where Armand used a fountain pen and a smile to destroy his enemies, Julian used a bottle of vodka and a loaded pistol. The tragedy that unfolded in Los Angeles in 1955 was not an accident. It was the inevitable combustion of a man raised in a vacuum of morality, a man who had been taught by observation that consequences were for other people. On the night of May 7th, 1955, the air inside Julian Hammer's Los Angeles home was thick with the smell of stale alcohol and aggression. It was his 26th birthday, a milestone that should have been celebrated with the sophisticated elite his father courted. Instead, Julian was drinking heavily with Bruce Whitlock, a former college roommate and one of the few people who tolerated his volatile temper. The two men had a history of friendship, but in the Hammer orbit, friendship was always transactional and fragile. As the night wore on and the liquor flowed, the conversation turned to a debt. It was a trivial sum, approximately $400 owed from a gambling session, an amount that Julian, the son of a multimillionaire, could have found in his couch cushions. But the pathology of the Hammer male is not driven by financial need. It is driven by dominance. Police reports and witness accounts suggest that the argument escalated rapidly. Julian, fueled by a toxic cocktail of alcohol and entitled rage, did not throw a punch. He retrieved a .38 caliber semi-automatic pistol. This was clearly an instrument of execution rather than a weapon of self-defense. According to the police reports filed later, Julian confronted Whitlock in the living room. There was no struggle, no intruders, no threat to Julian's life. He simply leveled the weapon and fired. The bullet struck Bruce Whitlock in the chest, tearing through vital organs and killing him almost instantly. In the silence that followed the gunshot, the reality of the act hung in the air. The heir to the Hammer fortune was a murderer. In a standard legal universe, the sequence of events following a homicide is predictable. Police arrival, arrest, arraignment, and trial. But the Hammer family did not live in a standard universe. The first call Julian made was likely not to the authorities, but to his father. Armand Hammer, then in the process of building his petroleum empire, received the news that his son had just killed a man. His reaction was not one of moral horror or paternal grief. It was a logistical assessment of a liability. Armand immediately activated the fixer protocol he had perfected during his years dealing with Soviet bureaucrats and corrupt Libyan officials. He did not rush to the scene to comfort his son. He sent a lawyer, and more importantly, he sent cash. The handling of the Bruce Whitlock murder case stands as one of the most egregious examples of justice obstruction in California history. Reports from the era indicate that a courier delivered $50,000 in cash to the lawyer representing Julian. Adjusted for inflation, this sum is equivalent to nearly $500,000 today. In the corrupt ecosystem of 1950s Los Angeles, this was an arsenal. The money was not used for a defense fund, it was used to rewrite reality. By the time the LAPD detectives began their investigation, the narrative had already been shifted. The dead man, Bruce Whitlock, was posthumously character assassinated, painted as an aggressor who had attacked Julian in his own home. The gambling debt became a violent robbery attempt. The legal machinery, greased by Armand's money, moved with terrifying efficiency. Despite the body lying in the morgue and the shooter standing in the living room with the smoking gun, Julian Hammer was never formally tried for murder. The charges were dismissed. The official ruling was self-defense. Julian walked away from the killing without spending a single night in a prison cell. This moment was the psychic breaking point for the family. It proved to Julian that he was truly untouchable. He had taken a human life, and his father's checkbook had washed the blood off his hands. The lesson was learned. There is no law that applies to a hammer. However, while Julian escaped the penitentiary, he created a prison of his own making within the walls of his home. The acquittal did not humble him. It unleashed him. With the knowledge that he could kill with impunity, Julian's behavior descended into a spiral of depravity that turned his domestic life into a horror show. The primary victims of this new reign of terror were his wife and his children, specifically his daughter, Casey Hammer. Casey Hammer, who would later become the sole whistleblower of the family, describes a childhood that reads like a gothic nightmare. The house was not a home, it was a weapon depot. Julian, paranoid and chemically unstable, kept loaded guns in every room. He would frequently brandish them during dinner, waving pistols at his wife and children to settle arguments or simply to instill fear. The sound of gunfire was the soundtrack of Casey's youth. Julian would shoot at the television set when he didn't like a program. He would fire rounds into the ceiling during drunken rages. The family lived in a state of perpetual siege, sleeping with one eye open, knowing that the man of the house was a ticking time bomb who had already killed once. But the violence was not limited to firearms. The sexual perversion that ran through the Hammer bloodline, from Armand's grooming of Martha Kaufman to the future crimes of Armie Hammer, manifested in Julian as incestuous abuse. In her memoirs, Casey Hammer alleged that her father sexually abused her when she was a child. This accusation adds a layer of heinousness to the Hammer profile that goes beyond mere criminality. It suggests a complete collapse of the incest taboo, a belief that the Hammer men were entitled to consume anyone within their orbit, even their own offspring. Julian viewed his daughter not as a child to be protected, but as an object to be used. The trauma inflicted on Casey was compounded by the silence of the family. The staff, the lawyers, and the matriarchs all looked away. They were on the payroll of Armand Hammer, and the first rule of employment was discretion. To speak out was to risk being cut off from the flow of money, or worse, to end up like Bruce Whitlock. Armand Hammer, the patriarch watching from his throne at Occidental Petroleum, was fully aware of his son's descent. He knew about the drinking, the guns, and the darkness inside Julian's house. His reaction was a chilling detachment. He viewed Julian not as a son to be saved, but as a failed experiment. In Armand's eyes, Julian was a defective clone. He lacked the discipline to be a great man. He was merely a violent one. Armand essentially quarantined Julian, providing him with enough money to stay drunk and out of the corporate headquarters, but cutting him out of the succession plan. He treated his son like a bad investment that needed to be written off. This rejection by the father fueled Julian's rage even further, creating a feedback loop of destruction. But Armand had already moved on. He had set his sights on the next generation. He looked at Julian's son, Michael Hammer, a young boy growing up in this house of horrors, and decided that he would be the heir. Armand bypassed his own son, plucking his grandson Michael out of the wreckage of Julian's home to mold him. But Armand failed to realize that Michael had already been poisoned. Michael had spent his formative years watching his father wave guns and abuse women. He had learned that violence was a form of communication and that money was the ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card. The legacy of the Bruce Whitlock murder was not just a dead body and a hush-money payment. It was the normalization of sociopathy within the family DNA. By buying Julian's freedom, Armand Hammer had effectively sanctioned murder as a lifestyle choice. He removed the guardrails of conscience for the generations that followed. As the 1970s approached, the murder gene lay dormant in Julian, suppressed by alcohol and isolation, but it was actively mutating in the grandson, Michael. The violence that had been crude and explosive in the father would become decadent and ritualized in the son. The House of Hammer had survived its first murder, but the cost was the soul of the family. They were no longer just corrupt capitalists. They were a clan of predators who had tasted blood and found that they could get away with it. Sex dungeons and multi-million-dollar fakes. The death of Armand Hammer in 1990 marked the end of the era of the great man within the dynasty and the beginning of the era of the parasite. In a final act of dynastic cruelty that would have impressed a Roman emperor, Armand deliberately bypassed his own son Julian in the line of succession. He viewed Julian as a failed experiment, a murderer who had required a cleanup crew, a drunk who lacked the killer instinct, and a liability who could not be trusted with the keys to the kingdom. Instead, Armand executed a leapfrog maneuver, transferring the entirety of his empire, the control of Occidental Petroleum shares, the chairmanship of the Armand Hammer Foundation, and the stewardship of the family's vast art collection, directly to his grandson, Michael Hammer. Michael was the chosen one, the golden boy who had been plucked from Julian's chaotic household and molded by Armand to be the perfect heir. He was handsome, seemingly disciplined, and presented to the world with a veneer of respectable piety. But forensic analysis of Michael's tenure reveals that Armand made a catastrophic miscalculation. He had not cultivated a successor. He had cultivated a mutation. Under Michael's stewardship, the cold strategic evil of the grandfather dissolved into a messy, decadent hedonism that combined the hypocrisy of a televangelist with the appetites of a Caligula. To the public observer in the 1990s and early 2000s, Michael Hammer was a pillar of the conservative establishment. He was a born-again Christian, a man who spoke the language of faith and redemption, eventually securing a seat on the Board of Regents at Oral Roberts University. He managed the family's philanthropic endeavors, shaking hands with dignitaries and cutting ribbons at cancer centers. But this public persona was a meticulously constructed mask designed to hide a private reality of staggering depravity. Michael lived a bifurcated existence, a Jekyll and Hyde scenario where the daytime Michael managed the portfolio and the nighttime Michael managed a personal dungeon. The physical epicenter of this dark duality was not a hidden bunker, but the very headquarters of the Armand Hammer Foundation in Westwood, Los Angeles. Deep within the executive suite of this tax-exempt charitable organization, a building legally mandated to serve the public good, Michael Hammer constructed a private sanctuary for his vices. The centerpiece of this room, an object that has since become the defining artifact of the family's moral collapse, was a piece of furniture colloquially known as the sex throne. Far from being a standard piece of eccentricity, this chair stood as a custom-built monument to domination. Standing nearly 7 feet tall and constructed from heavy dark wood, the chair was designed with a grotesque Gothic aesthetic. It was adorned with the carved heads of gargoyles, their mouths open in silent screams, lending the object an air of medieval torture. Detailed witness descriptions of the chair reveal its specific predatory function. At the base of the throne, integrated into the heavy wooden legs, was a fully functional cage. This enclosure was sized to hold a human being, forcing the occupant to crouch in a position of submission beneath the person sitting on the seat. The seat itself featured a bizarre cutout, a design choice explicitly engineered for functionality over comfort, ensuring the occupant remained in a position of total, detached dominance while using the person below. Witnesses and former staff members have described scenes where Michael would preside over drug-fueled gatherings from this high seat, treating women as livestock to be caged or used for his gratification. The psychological implications of this object are profound. It demonstrates that for Michael Hammer, sex was not an act of intimacy or even pleasure. It was an act of hierarchy. He needed to be physically elevated above his partners, surrounded by symbols of monstrosity, effectively turning the headquarters of his grandfather's legacy into a theater of degradation. This sex throne was merely the furniture of a broader lifestyle that was hemorrhaging cash. Unlike his grandfather, who possessed a genius for generating wealth through geopolitical manipulation, Michael Hammer possessed only a genius for consuming it. His appetite for luxury was insatiable. He maintained a fleet of classic cars, multiple estates, and a private jet that he treated as a taxi service. More critically, insiders reported a voracious appetite for illicit substances, with some estimates suggesting a burn rate of $50,000 a week on lifestyle maintenance and vices. This level of expenditure is unsustainable even for a dynasty as wealthy as the Hammers, especially when the primary revenue generator, Occidental Petroleum, was moving away from family control. The trust funds were deep, but they were not bottomless. As the liquidity crisis began to loom in the mid-2000s, Michael Hammer found himself in need of a new income stream. In a twist of fate that suggests the criminal gene is indeed hereditary, he turned to the exact same mechanism his grandfather had used 80 years prior: art fraud. The venue for this crime was the Knoedler Gallery in New York City. Founded in 1846, Knoedler was not merely a shop. It was the Vatican of the American art world. It was the oldest continually operating gallery in the United States, a name synonymous with blue-chip integrity. It was where the industrial titans of the Gilded Age, the Morgans, the Rockefellers, the Astors, had purchased their old masters. Michael Hammer owned this institution. It was the jewel in the family's cultural crown. But under his ownership, specifically between 1994 and 2011, this 165-year-old bastion of culture was hollowed out and transformed into a high-stakes fencing operation. The mechanism of the fraud was breathtaking in its simplicity and its audacity. The gallery began to sell a steady stream of masterpieces attributed to the titans of abstract expressionism: Mark Rothko, Jackson Pollock, Robert Motherwell, and Franz Kline. These paintings were presented to the market as fresh to the world, unknown works that had been discovered in the collection of a mysterious anonymous owner known only as Mr. X, later elaborated to be a secretive Swiss collector who had inherited them from his father. The gallery sold these works to the wealthiest and most sophisticated collectors in the world, including hedge fund managers and fashion executives, for sums totaling nearly $80 million. The buyers believed they were acquiring pieces of American history, validated by the impeccable reputation of the Knoedler Gallery. In reality, the entire inventory was a lie. There was no Swiss collector. There was no Mr. X. The paintings were not created in the lofts of 1950s New York by tortured geniuses. They were created in a garage in Queens, New York, by a 73-year-old Chinese immigrant named Pei Shen-Qian. Qian was a talented but destitute math teacher and painter who had been recruited by a small-time art dealer named Glafira Rosales. The operation was an assembly line of forgery. Rosales would find old canvases at flea markets to ensure the aging of the fabric was correct. She would bring them to Qian, who would paint a Rothko or a Pollock in an afternoon. He used tea bags to stain the canvas to mimic the yellowing of age. He used dirt from the vacuum cleaner to dust the back of the frames to simulate decades of storage. For his labor, Qian was paid a few $1,000s per painting, sometimes as little as $5,000 for a work that Knoedler would subsequently sell for $15 million. The question of Michael Hammer's culpability in the Knoedler scandal is the subject of intense forensic and legal debate, but the circumstantial and economic evidence paints a damning portrait. While Michael was not mixing the paint in the Queen's garage, he was the primary beneficiary of the crime. Internal documents and court testimonies from the subsequent lawsuits revealed that Michael treated the Knoedler Gallery not as a cultural institution but as his personal piggy bank. As the owner, he exerted immense pressure on the gallery's director, Anne Friedman, to generate profit. Emails surfaced in which Michael demanded immediate transfers of funds, often in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, to cover his personal expenses, his divorce settlements, his luxury car payments, and his credit card bills. This financial pressure created a toxic ecosystem within the gallery where "don't ask, don't tell" became the operational policy. The profit margins on the fake paintings were astronomical, often exceeding 4,000% compared to the slim commissions earned on legitimate consignment sales. For Michael Hammer, the math was irresistible. When forensic experts or scholars raised red flags about the works, noting that a pigment used in a Pollock wasn't invented until after the artist died, or that a signature on a Rothko looked hesitant, the gallery aggressively dismissed them. They needed the paintings to be real because Michael Hammer needed the money to maintain the sex throne and the private jet. He was effectively strip mining the 165-year-old reputation of the gallery to fund his debauchery, cannibalizing the family's cultural legacy for cash. The scheme unraveled in 2011, not because of a sudden attack of conscience, but because of forensic chemistry. A forensic analysis of one of the Pollock paintings revealed the presence of a yellow pigment that was not commercially available during Jackson Pollock's lifetime. The science shattered the myth. The FBI raided the gallery. The lawsuits began to pile up, led by furious billionaires who realized they had hung multi-million-dollar fakes on their walls. The Knoedler Gallery, unable to sustain the lie, abruptly closed its doors forever, ending a century and a half of history in disgrace. Michael Hammer managed to escape criminal prosecution, settling lawsuits quietly and hiding behind the corporate veil of the gallery structure. He claimed ignorance, positioning himself as an absentee owner who was duped by his staff, but the reputational damage was total. The Hammer name, which Armand had spent decades polishing, however deceptively, into a symbol of high culture, was now synonymous with cheap fraud. The historical irony was suffocating. Armand Hammer had started the family fortune by selling fake Fabergé eggs to American heiresses in the 1930s to fund Soviet espionage. 80 years later, his grandson ended the family legacy by selling fake Rothkos to American hedge funds to fund a sex addiction. The crime had not changed. It had merely been updated for a new market. The impact of this environment on the next generation cannot be overstated. Armie Hammer, Michael's son, spent his formative years inside this funhouse mirror of morality. He grew up watching his father perform the role of the pious Christian patriarch on Sunday while maintaining a dungeon at the office. He watched his father treat truth as a flexible commodity and women as disposable accessories. He saw that consequences were for poor people, and that if you had enough money, you could sell a lie to the world and walk away when it collapsed. Armie was not raised. He was infected. He absorbed the Hammer Code by osmosis, the absolute entitlement to pleasure, the dissociation from the pain of others, and the belief that the Hammer men were a species apart, subject to different laws of gravity and morality. The sex throne was not just a chair, it was a throne of succession. Michael Hammer was inadvertently grooming his son to take the family pathology to its final, most terrifying conclusion. The violence that had been financial in the grandfather, Armand, and physical in the father, Julian, and sexual transactional in the son, Michael, was about to mutate into something visceral and primal. The depraved gene was incubating in the handsome, charming Hollywood actor, waiting for the right moment to express itself. The art gallery was closed, the oil wells were sold, but the hunger remained. And this time, it wouldn't be satisfied with fake paint or illicit cash. It would demand flesh and blood when Hollywood's golden boy craved human flesh. If Armand Hammer was the architect who built the fortress, Julian was the brute who cracked the foundation, and Michael was the degenerate who turned the throne room into a dungeon, then Armie Hammer was designed to be the masterpiece. Born in 1986, Armand Douglas Armie Hammer was the genetic culmination of a century of eugenic wealth, privilege, and unchecked power. Standing 6'5" with the chiseled jawline of a classical statue, a baritone voice that commanded attention, and the golden aura of old money, he was the perfect camouflage for a rotting bloodline. Hollywood, an industry desperate for the next great leading man, embraced him as a modern-day Cary Grant. They cast him in roles that emphasized his princely demeanor, the aristocratic Winklevoss twins in The Social Network, the dashing Cold War spy in The Man from UNCLE, and the sensitive, romantic intellectual in Call Me By Your Name. To the public, he was the sanitized, upgraded version of the American dream, the proof that a family could evolve from robber barons to cultural icons. But a forensic analysis of his private life reveals that rather than an upgrade, Armie Hammer represented a terminal mutation. Beneath the bespoke suits and the red carpet smile, the depraved gene of the Hammer dynasty had evolved into a hunger that transcended simple violence or sexual dominance. It had become primal. It had become cannibalistic. The unmasking of the monster did not begin with a police raid or a courtroom verdict. It began with a digital hemorrhage that exposed the dark subconscious of the Hammer psyche. In January 2021, an anonymous Instagram account operating under the handle @House of Effie began to leak a series of direct messages DMs, allegedly sent by the actor to various women. Initially, the internet and the media treated these leaks with a degree of skepticism and morbid curiosity. They seemed too grotesque, too literary, and too outlandish to be real. They read like the script of a bad horror movie, not the private correspondence of a Golden Globe nominee. But as more women came forward, verifying timestamps and providing corroborating screenshots, the picture of a profound and terrifying pathology emerged. These were not the flirtations of a bored celebrity. They were the hunting logs of a predator who viewed women not as humans, but as livestock to be consumed. The language contained in these messages provides a terrifying window into the final stage of the Hammer family's moral decay. In one exchange, Army wrote the sentence that would become the epitaph of his career, "I am 100% a cannibal." This was not a metaphor for sexual veracity. The context surrounding the statement suggests a literal visceral craving. He followed this declaration with specific anatomical fantasies that betray a mind obsessed with the dissection of the human form. He wrote to one woman, "I want to eat you. I've never admitted that before. I want to drink your blood." In another exchange, he detailed a desire to cut off a woman's toe and keep it in his pocket as a memento, a literal piece of a human being to possess and carry with him. He spoke of breaking ribs, of barbecuing flesh, of consuming the heart. Defenders of the actor, including his legal team and a legion of online apologists, initially attempted to frame these messages as consensual BDSM roleplay, a kink taken out of context. They argued that this was merely extreme sexual fantasy between consenting adults. However, forensic psychology distinguishes clearly between consensual power exchange and pathological predation. In healthy BDSM, the focus is on the mutual experience, safety, and the negotiated limits of the partners. In Armie Hammer's messages, the language is entirely about consumption and destruction. He does not speak of pleasure. He speaks of ownership and negation. He writes to one woman, "You are my property now. You belong to me." He refers to women as kittens, a dehumanizing term that reduces them to pets that need to be trained and disciplined. This linguistic pattern is the echo of his ancestors screaming across the decades. It is the echo of his great-grandfather, Armand, who renamed his mistresses, forced them into surgery, and treated them as customizable dolls. It is the echo of his grandfather Julian, who caged his children in a house of fear. It is the echo of his father Michael, who locked women in a cage beneath his throne. The desire to eat a partner is the ultimate expression of the Hammer family ethos, to completely negate the humanity of another person and reduce them to a resource to be used up. For Armand, people were assets. For Michael, they were toys. For Armie, they were food. The evolution was complete. The family had moved from exploiting the labor of others to exploiting the very flesh of others. The digital fantasies soon bled into physical reality, proving that the text messages were not idle daydreams, but statements of intent. As the scandal broke, the victims began to speak, transforming the screenshots into crime scene testimony. Two women in particular provided accounts that stripped away any ambiguity about Armie's nature, revealing a pattern of abuse that was systematic, ritualistic, and terrifyingly violent. Paige Lorenzi, a young model who dated Armie in 2020, detailed a relationship defined by escalating physical torture disguised as romance. She described how Armie would practice knife play on her, tracing the blade over her skin until he drew blood, testing the limits of her fear. But the defining incident, the undeniable signature of the Hammer ownership, occurred when he decided to mark her permanently. In a bedroom in Los Angeles, Armie used a knife to carve the letter A into the flesh of her groin. This act requires a deep forensic pause. This was not a tattoo, it was a scarification. It was the branding of cattle. Throughout history, branding has been the tool of the slave owner and the rancher, a way to declare irrefutable ownership over a living thing. By carving his initial A for Armie, A for Armand, the cursed initial of the dynasty, into her skin. He was declaring to the world and to her that she was no longer an autonomous human being. She was a hammer possession, tagged and filed like a piece of stolen Romanov art or a barrel of crude oil. Lorenzi recounted how, after carving his initial into her skin, Army proceeded to lick the blood from the wound. This act is a terrifying synthesis of violence and narcissism. It was a vampiric ritual of consumption, a way for him to physically ingest the pain he had inflicted. It was the cannibal fantasy enacted in miniature. Then came Effie, the woman behind the initial leaks, who stepped forward to deliver the most serious accusation of all. In a tearful press conference, she accused Armie Hammer of violently raping her for 4 hours in Los Angeles in 2017. She described an ordeal of extreme brutality that had nothing to do with role play. She alleged that he slammed her head against a wall repeatedly and beat her feet with a crop so severely that she could not walk properly for a week. She claimed that during the assault, she tried to escape, signaling her lack of consent, but he restrained her with a level of physical force that terrified her. Effie's testimony moved the narrative from the realm of weird kinks to the realm of violent felony. It exposed the reality that the cannibal fantasies were likely just the tip of an iceberg of non-consensual violence. It highlighted the terrifying shibari connection. Armie was obsessed with the Japanese art of rope bondage. He would tie women up, rendering them completely immobile and helpless. While shibari can be an art form, in Armie's hands it was a weapon of incapacitation. It was the modernization of his father's cage. Michael Hammer needed a wooden structure to trap women. Armie used ropes. The methodology is identical, the total removal of the woman's agency. Armie needed his partners to be objects, statues of flesh, because a statue cannot say no, a statue cannot leave, and a statue exists solely for the viewer. He was recreating the dynamic of the naughty chair in his own bedroom, turning his partners into captive audiences for his twisted performance of masculinity. The psychological profile of Armie Hammer that emerges from these accounts is that of a man who is profoundly empty. Like his father and great-grandfather, he seemingly lacks a core self. He tries to fill that void by consuming others, financially, emotionally, and in his fantasies, physically. He told his partners he wanted to break them, to hollow them out, to make them part of him. This is the ultimate narcissism, the belief that other people only exist to be absorbed into the self. The fall of Armie Hammer was swift, absolute, and unprecedented in the modern era of celebrity. Hollywood, an industry that has tolerated decades of bad behavior, recoiled in horror. The cannibalism angle was too visceral, too nightmarish even for Tinseltown to spin. The industry that had protected Harvey Weinstein and Roman Polanski could not protect a man who talked about barbecuing human ribs. He was dropped by his powerful agency, WME. He was fired from every upcoming film project, including a romantic comedy with Jennifer Lopez, and with bitter irony, a series about the making of The Godfather. The Golden Boy became radioactive overnight, but in the aftermath of the explosion, a strange and pathetic reality emerged, one that serves as the final indictment of the Hammer legacy. The Hammer fortune, the billions amassed by Armand through Soviet gold and Libyan oil, had largely evaporated. The decades of mismanagement by Michael, the failed investments, the fraud lawsuits from the Knoedler scandal, and the excessive drug-fueled spending had drained the coffers. The trust funds that Armie relied on to fund his predation were running dry. In July 2022, a photo surfaced on social media that served as the perfect visual epitaph for the family's collapse. It showed Armie Hammer, the man who once wore bespoke Armani on the red carpet at the Oscars, standing in the lobby of a hotel in the Cayman Islands. He was wearing a generic polo shirt. He was working as a concierge and a timeshare salesman. The image is jarring, almost surreal. The great-grandson of the man who shook hands with Lenin, the man who treated U.S. presidents as peers, was now trying to sell vacation weeks to middle-class tourists to pay his bills. This is not just a celebrity downfall. It is a forensic conclusion. It proves that the Hammer curse is real, but it is not supernatural. It is the inevitable economic and moral entropy of a criminal enterprise. The depraved gene that drove them to conquer, to kill, and to consume had finally consumed itself. There was no one left to cover up the crimes. There was no Armand to bribe the prosecutors with $50,000 cash. There was no Julian to threaten the witnesses with a gun. There was no Michael to hide behind a fake religious charity. There was only Armie standing in the ruins of a century of exploitation, stripped of his mask. The House of Hammer had finally run out of other people's blood to drink. The prince was not a king in waiting. He was just a hungry ghost in a polo shirt, selling a paradise he could no longer afford to inhabit. The autopsy was complete. The patient was dead. The financial and moral collapse of the House of Hammer. The saga of the Hammer dynasty did not end with the cinematic grandeur that its patriarch Armand Hammer had scripted for himself. There was no final triumphant gala, no cutting of a ribbon at a new museum wing, and no state funeral attended by weeping dignitaries. Instead, the House of Hammer collapsed with the scratching of a pen on a bankruptcy filing and the solitary beep of a hospital monitor in a sterile room. After a century of dominating the American industrial, political, and cultural landscape, the empire was reduced to rubble not by an external enemy, but by the rot that had been festering within its own walls since 1919. The oil wells have been sold to strangers. The art galleries are shuttered and disgraced. The private jets are grounded. The infamous sex throne is gone, likely dismantled or destroyed. All that remains of the family that once claimed to own the world is a cautionary tale written in the language of forensic psychology and financial ruin. A final, unsparing autopsy on the empire's corpse reveals exactly how the depraved gene ultimately consumed its host. The catalyst for the final demolition was not a federal prosecutor or a corporate rival. It was a member of the tribe, a woman who had been systematically erased from the family narrative. Casey Hammer, the daughter of the violent Julian and the estranged aunt of Armie, emerged from the shadows in 2022 as the arsonist of the dynasty. For decades, Casey had lived on the periphery of the Hammer world, intentionally cut out of the massive inheritance that flowed directly to her cousin Michael. In the ruthless patriarchal calculus of Armand Hammer, Casey was a woman, and therefore irrelevant to the line of succession. She was viewed as damaged goods from Julian's house of horrors, a loose end to be tied off with a small stipend and ignored. But Armand, for all his strategic brilliance, failed to calculate the destructive power of a witness who has nothing left to lose. When Casey Hammer sat before the cameras as the primary consultant and narrator for the explosive documentary series House of Hammer, she was not merely giving an interview, she was committing an act of dynastic treason. By breaking the omerta, the mafia-style code of silence that had protected the Hammers for 4 generations, she dismantled the firewall that had kept the family's crimes hidden. She corroborated the dark history of her grandfather Armand's espionage and manipulation. She detailed the terrifying abuse she suffered at the hands of her father, Julian. Most importantly, she provided the contextual backbone for the accusations against her nephew, Army. Her testimony proved that Army was not an anomaly or a bad apple. He was the inevitable product of a factory designed to produce monsters. Casey's role was that of the forensic pathologist opening the rib cage of the family history to show the world the malignant tumor growing inside. She sacrificed her own privacy to ensure that the Hammer curse died with her generation, effectively burning down the house to save the village. While Casey was destroying the family's reputation from the outside, a far more pedestrian reality was destroying it from the inside. Simple economics. The most shocking revelation to emerge in the wake of the Army Hammer scandal was not sexual, but financial. The world had assumed that the Hammers possessed generational wealth, the kind of infinite capital that renders a family immune to the laws of gravity. But a forensic audit of the family's finances in the final years reveals a starkly different picture. The Hammers were broke. Armand Hammer was a billionaire, certainly, but he left behind a labyrinthine estate designed to control his heirs rather than enrich them indefinitely. He wanted them to dance for their supper. However, the third generation, Michael Hammer, was a weapon of mass financial destruction. Unlike his grandfather, who woke up every morning thinking of ways to extract wealth from the Soviet Union or Libya, Michael woke up thinking of ways to spend it. He did not work, he consumed. The burn rate of Michael Hammer's lifestyle was catastrophic and unsustainable. Between the maintenance of multiple luxury estates that sat empty for months, the fleet of classic cars that required climate-controlled storage, the divorce settlements, the hush money payments to silence former lovers, and the alleged $50,000 a week substance abuse habit, Michael was treating the family trust like a personal ATM with no withdrawal limit. The Knoedler Gallery scandal was the final economic fatal blow. While Michael managed to avoid a prison sentence for the sale of the fake Rothkos and Pollocks, the civil liability was devastating. The legal settlements required to silence the defrauded billionaire collectors. Hedge fund managers, who did not take kindly to being swindled, drained tens of millions of dollars from the family coffers. The piggy bank that Armand had filled with Soviet gold and Libyan oil was smashed open and emptied to pay for Michael's lawyers and vices. This financial implosion explains the surreal and pathetic image of Armie Hammer that surfaced in July 2022. The photograph of the movie star selling timeshares in the Cayman Islands was not a piece of performance art, nor was it method acting for a role. It was a necessity. Armie had been cut off because there was nothing left to cut. The Bank of Daddy was closed because the bank was insolvent. The dynasty that had once bailed out Julian Hammer with $50,000 cash for a murder charge in 1955 could no longer afford to bail out Armie Hammer for a PR crisis in 2021. The shield of invincibility, which was always forged from gold, had rusted away, forcing the Hammers to face the one thing they had avoided for 100 years: reality. Lay the 5 generations of Hammermen side by side, and a terrifying pattern emerges. This isn't a random collection of crimes, but a linear escalation of pathology, a descent into moral entropy that accelerated with every son. The rot began with Julius Hammer, the root of the tree. His crime was medical manslaughter, the death of Marie Oganesov. While horrific, it was an act of incompetence mixed with desperation, a transactional crime committed in the shadows of a Bronx clinic. There was still a semblance of consequence. Julius went to prison. He paid a price. The mutation metastasized in the second generation with Armand Hammer. His crime was systemic corruption. Armand escalated the family pathology to a geopolitical level. He didn't just break laws, he rewrote them. He bought presidents, bribed dictators, and laundered money for empires. But his violence was largely psychological and strategic. He erased the identities of his mistresses, forcing them into surgery and changing their names, treating them as assets to be optimized. He replaced morality with strategy, turning the family into a cold, efficient intelligence agency. By the third generation with Julian Hammer, the discipline of Armand fractured into chaos. The crime became violent murder. The violence shifted from the psychological to the physical, from the boardroom to the bedroom. Julian was a brute who killed a friend over a gambling debt and terrorized his children with loaded guns. He introduced the element of unhinged, chemically fueled aggression into the bloodline, proving that the money could no longer hide the madness, only delay the punishment. The fourth generation, Michael Hammer, took the violence and turned it inward, creating a crime of perversion and fraud. Michael lacked the brilliance of Armand and the raw danger of Julian, so he retreated into a decadent, hypocritical shadow world. He built dungeons beneath charity headquarters, sold fake art to fund his addictions, and mixed religious fervor with sexual sadism. His contribution to the gene pool was total hypocrisy and the normalization of seeing people as objects to be caged. Finally, we arrive at the terminal mutation, Armie Hammer. Here at the end of the line, the pathology reaches its horrifying logical conclusion. The crime is cannibalism. Armie did not want to build an empire like Armand, nor did he simply want to shoot an enemy like Julian. He wanted to consume the object of his desire. The text messages declaring, "I am 100% a cannibal and I want to eat your ribs," represent the final collapse of the boundary between self and other. The Hammer gene had evolved into a viral hunger that sought to literally ingest people. It is the ultimate act of narcissism, the belief that another human being exists solely to be absorbed into the self, to be digested and turned into fuel for the predator. The evolution was complete. The family had moved from exploiting labor to exploiting laws to exploiting bodies to finally consuming flesh. The biological end of this dark lineage arrived in November 2022 with the death of Michael Hammer. At the age of 67, the man who had sat on the sex throne and presided over the destruction of the Knoedler Gallery succumbed to cancer. His death was a stark poetic contrast to the passing of his grandfather. When Armand died in 1990, it was global news. Presidents sent flowers, the business world mourned, and his obituary took up full pages in the New York Times. When Michael died, the reaction was a mixture of indifference and public disdain. He died in the shadow of the scandal he helped create, estranged from the society he desperately wanted to impress, viewed not as a titan of industry, but as the enabler of a toxic legacy. There were no eulogies praising his business acumen. He was remembered only as the bridge between the corruption of the past and the perversion of the present. His death marked the official end of the Hammer power structure. The king was dead, the prince was disgraced, and the castle was in foreclosure. The House of Hammer is no tragedy. Tragedy implies the loss of something noble. This is a cold correction, a brutal testament that while money buys silence for a generation, it cannot bribe DNA. It serves as a warning that the impunity of the super rich is an illusion sustained only by cash flow. You can bribe a judge, you can settle a lawsuit, and you can buy a new face, but you cannot bribe your own DNA. The trauma you inflict on your children, the coldness, the surveillance, the cruelty, will eventually mutate and come back to destroy you. Today, the name Hammer no longer evokes images of oil wells, diplomacy, or philanthropic wings in art museums. It evokes images of branded flesh, fake paintings, and text messages about eating human blood. The legacy is not ash. It is toxic waste that will take generations to clean up. The prince is selling timeshares to tourists who have no idea who he is. The king is rotting in his grave, his secrets exposed to the light. And the victims, the women, the children, the defrauded collectors, are finally the ones writing the history books. The file is closed. The dynasty is dead. Justice, delayed by a century, has finally arrived.